We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today and recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place by storytelling and through the sharing of experiences. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's in that spirit that we're meeting today for this webinar. My name is Anthony Caruana, and on behalf of CIM, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar where we talk about maximising tenant satisfaction, which is, I think, the fourth or fifth webinar in a series on the future of property operations. So today we're going to discuss all things about the tenant experience and how managers and owners can maximise their tenant satisfaction. The acknowledgement of country that I started with does talk about the sharing of experiences through storytelling. And today we have three great storytellers who are going to guide us through that. But it's also for you who are online with us today. If you have questions that you want to ask our three panelists, please do so as we go along today. And if you do have any insights or anything you want to share, please do that as well. We can't promise to get to every single question, but we'll do our very best as we go through today. So today's panel consists of an all-star lineup of industry experts from retail and office properties. They are all equally passionate about maintaining buildings where people are happy to work, shop and play. So I'm going to start by welcoming Lisa Atkins, the National Head of Asset Management at Knight Frank. Lisa's had a whole lot of different senior roles at Knight Frank, Dexus and Development Victoria, and she brings a huge number of and a wealth of insights and expertise in asset management. Chris Greenall is the National Head of Operations at QIC. He's held senior roles at No Vision Property Group, Vicinity Centres, and he's spanned operations, capital planning, delivery and asset refurbishment. And finally, we have David Wright, CIM's Executive Chairman and an investor, expert advisor and board member to a number of companies whose core purpose is to solve global challenges like climate change. David's held various C-suite positions and has founded over 10 technology companies. So welcome, Chris, David and Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So as I said before, if you do have any questions, please shoot them through. Use the Q&A function. It's on the bottom of the Zoom screen that you've got in front of you at the moment. For your questions, please make them specific. So if they are for a particular person, please let us know that so that I direct the question to the right person as we go along. And if we do run out of time, we'll keep a log of all the questions and follow them up after the webinar. After this is all over, in about an hour's time, you'll receive a link to the recording of the webinar, and you'll also get a short survey to complete. So if you could please do that, that would be fantastic as well. The surveys, we do take those very seriously as they help us refine not just the topics that we look at in future, but the way we run these webinars. So let's get started. We're going to talk firstly about how important tenant satisfaction is and how it's tracked and monitored. So Lisa, the indicators that you use to track asset performance, where does tenant satisfaction sit?
Look, I think it's really climbed up the list. Probably still start with the financial performance, right? The NOI of the asset. But I think there's increasingly a recognition that that's a lag indicator of how the asset is doing and how it's going to do. You have that, you have safety and risk, which will always need to be very high up the list and can't be ignored. Increasingly high up the list as well is the ESG performance, the neighbours ratings and other performance tools that are being used. But again, those are also lag indicators of the performance of the building. So I think there is now an increasing focus on tenant satisfaction and any data, any metrics, any evidence that you can get your hands on around that. So that's not just your annual tenant rep survey that we all used to focus on years ago in order to get a once-a-year read on what one or two people in the tenancy thought of the experience of the building. Now there's, an increasing focus on getting any evidence that we can out of pulse surveys from all of the occupiers of the building, and then anecdotal feedback that we can get from concierge, from the FMs, from anyone who's having conversations with the people who pass through the building. So yeah, I think those are all considered to be really important to getting a read on what's going to happen around renewals, retention, the return to work, the levels of occupancy of the building, which all feeds into the long-term performance, financial performance of the asset.
Thanks, Lisa. So Chris, from the retail perspective, how do you monitor how satisfied retailers are?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Look, very similar themes to what Lisa just touched on. We have our tenant surveys, which is an indication in a point in time, and not always the best indicator, but a source of data. Our major tenant relationships are really important. So within shopping centres, we have what traditionally called the big boxes, and those major tenants, their view and how we're performing is really important to us. And then our centre management relationships. So our centre management teams play a really important role in managing that tenant relationship on the sites. So that feedback and garnishing the feedback from the team that are on the ground, dealing with the retailers every day, is really important. So they're the key way we tackle that tenant satisfaction piece.
What about from your perspective, David?
Yeah, we look at a lot at leading indicators and then feed into actions that ultimately will drive the lagging reporting and others. So for a long time there's been an increasing amount of measurement around core data, things like temperature and humidity and airflow and things like that. That's been around, but it's now more framing into an indication of how good that environment is. So this, sort of what you might call indoor air quality is one way of doing that. We have our own index that we use, which brings in things like CO2 and airflow speeds and things like that. But it's now far more about, we're all aligned with creating the best environment for a person who's in that facility to have the best possible time working, shopping, whatever it might be. And so for those, we've got to break that down and say, well, what does that mean? And often that's about things like, if they're there and it's stuffy, they're not going to enjoy it. It sounds simple, but those are the things that people complain about. But then as a tenant, you're complaining about responsiveness. How quickly did you get a response when you raised an issue? We try and make sure you don't do that by tracking the things that are going to lead to a complaint and to do that. But even when we do that, how quickly you resolve, you're able to come back with information is really important. So we track a lot of that. And then we track a lot around how quickly things get solved. As much as you can manage the client's complaints and concerns when they do happen, how quickly you resolve it really, really matters as well. So we try and create an environment where we're starting to now collect data that's, and we're seeing this a lot from our clients, where they want comparative data. They don't just want it's good up to a level, like it meets neighbours' indoor air quality minimum. They want to say, is it better than someone else? Is it the top tier of someone else? So that notion of having to earn a person come back to work in the case of an office, or to get people to come in, is driving significant more data around what is best performance rather than what is minimum performance, and how are those types of things happening. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're also seeing an increase in, and Lisa mentioned this, around compliance tracking. So things like CO2, carbon monoxide, those types of things are becoming much more required to be tracked today. And hopefully these things are not just tracked as a monitoring thing, they're tracked so that you can frame up a better deal for rent, a better deal for occupancy, and more likely for people to stay, a better NOI for your premises. So sometimes the things we track aren't necessarily tenant satisfaction, they're the efficiency of achieving a level so that the tenant doesn't experience any loss in satisfaction, but we can save money. So there's kind of a sophistication around tracking both improvement, but also tracking what you might call holding and meeting and exceeding expectations.
It was interesting. The three of you really did talk about how we're moving from this world of seeing what happened yesterday to predicting really what's going to happen tomorrow. You're all looking towards this more proactive model around monitoring satisfaction and what you can do to track things before they escalate into some sort of issue. Lisa, you mentioned NOI being a lag indicator. How strongly does tenant satisfaction influence financial metrics like NOI?
Well, it's a very direct, but sometimes extended journey, you know, of linkage, right? If there is any dissatisfaction, if there's any concerns with responsiveness, if there's any levels of, I'm not sure this is the right place for us, within the occupiers of the building, that will bubble up, and that feedback will start to hit the ears of the C-suite decision makers. And in the environment that we're in right now, and I don't see any evidence that it's about to change anytime soon, that war on talent that we've been all talking about for the last decade is now like, I don't know, it's not a war anymore. It's like, I don't know, it's a very challenging situation to find and retain good talent. So no one's going to stick around in a building where folks aren't happy and don't want to come to work. So in terms of renewal, in terms of expansion, you know, as businesses change their requirements, it's actually so much easier for them to change the building, you know, in terms of getting a new fit out and everything that you need and want for as your requirements change. There's a lot of ways in which it's easier to move, and we need to make it harder for them to move and make it more painful. And one way to do that is just to get people really attached to the place and make them feel like it's their second home, and they really want to be there, and they're proud to be there, and they feel connected to the place. So that kind of stickiness is, you know, directly impacts the WALE of the building. So it's not just your NOI, it's your values that are directly impacted.
And one thing that I'd add to that from Lisa, which I think is super interesting for us, our experience is that often NOI and tenant satisfaction or experience are actually linked in a strange way. And it would seem obvious when you think about it. When people are experiencing a bad experience in terms of at least their operation, what it means is I'm using too much energy, my machines are breaking down, I'm not responding to things quickly. All those things cost money. And when you fix those things, what you end up with is a better tenant experience, but actually it saves you considerably money on your NOI, and it comes straight off your bottom line. You spent it last year, this year you don't spend it. Going forward, it's also the collaboration between all of the parties to utilize the benefits of those things so you can do more for less, because our view is for tenant satisfaction now, you have to do more. What you did before is not enough. Going from where Lisa is, it has to be a great place for you to work, better than home, you know. We've all been at home, but it can be stuffy sometimes. It can be noisy. It can be, there's things that we can use, but what we can't do is allow our premises to be weak in that competitive threat to get people into the business. But today you can do that and actually save money doing it at the same time, at least in some areas. Fit out and other things can cost a lot of money. But there's so many opportunities that we see, very, very significant changes in NOI, which come and they push the dial in both directions at the same time. Higher NOI, higher tenant satisfaction.
And lower outgoings.
Really,
I mean, I think lower outgoings, you're not necessarily often under pressure to lower the outgoings in terms of retention, but in terms of leasing up, you know, the vacant space, you really want to contain your outgoings. And in this, it is the inflationary environment that we're in right now, that is a really big issue. I mean, everybody's working on their budgets right now, and there's a, you know, it's an absolute shock to the system when people see what inflation is doing to the costs of operating a building. And we can't allow outgoings to blow out to a point where the business is, you know, like people will just, they will reduce their requirements or relocate. So yeah, it's efficiency is absolutely needs to be the number one focus at the moment.
The other thing that was interesting in that is, and it wasn't something I hadn't really thought about, but just the quality of the experience is now an employee retention issue. When you start talking about how comfortable is the building, because no one wants to work in a, you know, stuffy, hot, noisy place. So there are things you can do about that. I just want to quickly dive to a question that we have from the audience for Chris. Chris, how are you helping to implement actual change in the built environment to assist tenants and landlords achieve better sustainability, particularly with outcomes related to ESG strategies before 2030, without negative financial impact on either the tenants or on the landlords?
Yeah, good question. There's a bit in that.
That's a big question.
Yeah, there is a bit in that. I guess I'll start in terms of what we're doing in our in QIC space in terms of shopping centres. Look, really builds on what Lisa was just saying around efficiency. The efficiency is everything, and the industry is going through, I guess, significant we haven't seen these sort of headwinds on our expense for 20, 25 years. I argue probably we're in uncharted ground, where all the REITs and real estate owners across the country are looking at 6 to 7 to 9% increases in their expense outgoings, which is pretty standard across the industry at the moment. So that's placing a lot of pressure on our NOI and tenant outgoings in particular in our case. So what we're doing, it surrounds technology. We have a connected centres strategy, which talks to the technology component and data gathering, which SIM are heavily involved in as part of that. But that's around gathering the data and driving our critical plant in particular to an inch of its life. So we focus on our large energy users, which is predominantly the largest expense in our buildings, and we focus on really intensively managing those pieces of plant through technology. And it's so that's one strategy. The other, and again, that links into ESG as well. So our net zero target, we're moving, and the strategy is built around that for a net zero 2028 in QIC's case. Our connected centre strategy, our plant replacement, capital planning and replacement strategy as well, replacing, like all shopping centres across the country, we have 30-year-old package units and 20-year-old chillers, and they're very inefficient pieces of equipment. So it's identifying those, putting in the right strategy to replace those while still not impacting or not burdening our capital and the valuation of the assets, not burdening the tenant outgoings. And that's the real balancing act that I think everyone across the industry is working through at the moment. I've probably missed a big chunk of that question as well, but yeah.
Yeah, I might.
Happy to circle back.
Yeah, I might.
I was just going to say, so I'm going, David.
Yeah, I was going to say, while there's a whole discussion about ESG and ESG strategies and things like this, what we are seeing is that the expectation of a tenant, and they're going to have to report up their ESG outcomes from their relationship with our suppliers of rent and stuff. So they're wanting better performance, better data, so that they can use it for themselves. And so there's low-hanging fruit in a way, and I say that loosely, but in terms of improving energy efficiency, which is a large chunk of net zero, as we talked about, increasing better decisions about capital to increase performance over time. There's power purchasing and stuff like that, which is a lot driven by the data that you provide to the providers, so you can get the best ESG outcome. And then there's offset strategies, and there are things like that you need data to be able to do as part of the picture. What's happened from a tenant satisfaction perspective is it's a whole of ecosystem issue. So the tenants care about it. The operators care about it. The investors are pushing really hard about it. So it's this kind of cycle. And one of the challenges is to meet those objectives in an economically efficient way, because you could solve it. We always say you can get to net zero with any building on our portfolio if you just turn everything off. But of course, that would be great, right? And so you've got this pressure to make sure that you achieve that, which we believe you can achieve, and you can use technology to do it. But the tenant satisfaction has to be better, can't be worse through that process. Yeah. And so that does change the kind of approaches and things that you might otherwise be able to do.
I think from a tenant perspective, Dave, tenants are taking an active role in this. They are requesting. We have a electricity on-selling network through our shopping centres. we have tenants requesting green power, and that's even 3 years, 4 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. There was always a couple leading the pack, like Country Road and those type of organisations, but very rare. Now we're getting a very large demand for the supply of green power. And again, to answer the question before, part of that is in the solar solution. So there's a rollout across our assets, and many organisations are doing it, the large solar rollouts across all our buildings. That's one solution for the green power, and part of the solution for net zero, not the full solution, but part of it. Yeah.
So, Chris, just based on what you're tracking and what you've been seeing, how have tenant priorities shifted over time? I mean, what are the top priorities for the retailers in the centres you operate for their positive experience?
Look, there's two that haven't changed really over my journey in real estate, and there's a third which I'll touch on that is reasonably new. Obviously, return or profitability is still the #1 priority. So the NOI, retailers need to make a buck, landlords need to make a buck, and that's as the world works. So they're focused on their profitability now. A couple of things obviously influence that. In our case, in shopping centres, it's customers walking through the door, and a number of other factors, but it's having the customers there in the first place to be able to make the sale. Then it runs down to the expense management side, and the experience. So the customer experience is really important. So that's how can I find a car park when I come to the centre? How clean is the centre? The toilet's clean. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it comfortable? Is it secure and safe? That is really a priority for tenants and around attracting the customer. So profitability, and that's around that expense management, the customer experience piece. And then the third, which we're starting to see, is that omni-channel, click and collect, online sales, and that part of it. So, certainly some of the more progressive tenants now are really focused on click and collect facilities, parcel pickup, which shopping centres aren't designed for. So there's a bit of retrofit going on, certainly around for your Woolworths and Coles and some of those major tenants in particular around that part of their business. So that's what I'm seeing, certainly in the operational space. Yeah.
So, Lisa, what sorts of major changes have you noticed in terms of tenant, office tenant expectations? I mean, obviously hybrid office arrangements are pretty solidly embedded in the working milieu now. How has this sort of changed things for the clients and the companies you work with?
Look, I think it's a really dramatic change, and I'm not sure that the depth of the change has fully sunk in for some building owners and some businesses yet. I think, there are still many businesses who've just said, that's it, you need to be back in the office 4 days or 5 days a week, compulsory. I don't think they are going to be the majority anytime soon. And I think that they are already finding that many of them have to make compromises in order to retain and attract the best talent. But generally speaking, there is a lot of flexibility in the mix now to the number of days that you're in the office, to where you work and how you work and when you arrive and when you leave, all of those things. So that really has driven a real change in expectations around, because the question now, whether it's a daily question or whether it's a sort of broader weekly question, is, where will I be more productive and more comfortable, at home or in the office? So the questions that, the considerations when you're asking that question are, things like, is there a third space somewhere where I can break away if I need some focused time away from the noise, or if I need to have a one-on-one chat with somebody in a comfortable, friendly environment that's not a boardroom? Are there places I can go to get a cup of tea? Do those places have good, USB cable charging for all of my tech? Do I have mobility and all of that convenience and comfort that I would have at home? Then there's the question of when we are in the office together, are there meeting rooms that have the right technology so that we can include the person that's in another time zone or is at their kitchen table at home? Then there's that whole sort of health and well-being thing of where am I going to be best off from a well-being perspective? Is there good facility for end of trip showers and stretching and changing and lockers to keep all my stuff in? Is there somewhere where I can buy not just a coffee, but actually, or a pastry, but healthy food that would be as good for me as what I might be able to pull out of my fridge at home? And I think that's quite different from even just immediately prior to 2020, we had a huge focus on convenience and on how to support people being, doing very long days, 5 days a week at least in the office. So how can we make sure that they could get their dry cleaning and their food shopping and their daycare and their everything they might need, the chemist and everything, either on site or deliverable very close by and super convenient. I think there's less focus on that now because there isn't a recognition. Some of those things, people will duck out early or arrive late if they need to access that closer to home. But what we really need to do is make the time that they do spend in the office incredibly productive and incredibly comfortable. So it's a super different environment. And I think another thing too is, when people are coming back in, they really want a sense of community. The thing that they can't get at home is to be gathered around, by others who are sort of all rowing in the same direction, building connection, building collaboration within their workplace and within their building. So I think there's probably, there's still an appeal to that kind of surprise and delight activation type of thing, but it's sometimes a little less efficient to be giving out chocolates and giving out this, free coffees and this and that. It really depends on the day, whether you're going to have the critical mass you need and what benefit are you going to get from it. But I think when there are things that bring meaning and bring connection, ability to engage in some sort of a relevant fundraiser or some sort of a relevant, learning opportunity, things like that, a lot of times that does really hold appeal for people and does sort of get a lot of interest.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
this
that's really
is
interest. Sorry.
no, you go.
Yeah, I was saying what we are starting to see is a lot of different questions being asked than kind of that we had before, and a lot of things that we're a provider of data. We're not necessarily a provider always of the solution, so we're not always sure exactly what the question's about. But things like I was in the US a few weeks ago. And London, same time, both places, the number of WeWorks and squares and everything on every single street in the city was extraordinary. And so this notion of a changing dynamic in the office environment was really significant. But we also saw some research came out last week, around particularly around office buildings and the change in there. And they follow exactly what Lisa was saying, that there was a move to premiumization, or at least attraction back to work, and really trying to break that down to understand what is that, what will create that. So for example, even as I'm a bit of a coffee nut, but I was really happy to see that one of them has to be good coffee in the building. Has to be healthy food, not unhealthy food. There has to be places. And what we see is dynamic movement in buildings that we'd never seen before. So people come in, they sit in their same space, they sit in their dog box. It doesn't change too much. Now you're seeing areas where large areas, there's no one in them. And then there's 50 people in a meeting room, and then there's a huddle space, and then there's somewhere else. So there's this really dynamic movement, and people are trying to measure that so that they can curate the best outcome from it. To do it. So there's a lot of, remember, there was always this impression that people said when people go and work remotely, they won't be as productive. The data came back and said, actually, that's not true. And so then you've got to say, well, we can't use that argument, even though so many in industry are saying they ultimately believe that there is a sense of community and an advantage of getting people together and a sort of vibrancy that comes with people being in the same room, but they haven't had data specifically collected about that. They'd have data on COVID of work environments. So now they believe something to be the case, but they aren't actually collecting it. So we're getting these really interesting questions about, could you tell us, you know, how many people are on different floors and moving and how much they're doing and stuff like this, because previously that wasn't something that they considered as much.
I think that's really, I would just add to that and say that, you know, that productivity thing, yes, I think we saw that productivity didn't necessarily dip. It sometimes did go up depending on the role of the person. But what we have started to see as we've had a more extended run with this experiment is that team performance drops, even if individual productivity holds, because we're not just all individual operators. You know, when it comes to onboarding new starters, when it comes to training up and developing, you know, young graduates who've never worked in an office and don't know how do I make a call like this? How do I have this kind of a conversation? They get it through osmosis, which you can't get from your kitchen table. But I think that is why I think we're not seeing the dramatic drops in space requirements. There have been some sectors that have done some real slashing, but a lot of sectors have held fast and just redeployed the space in different ways. You know, collaboration spaces for people to gather when they're in the office have become much more of a focus. And the dog boxes, as you called them, I think that's a lot easier to compromise on. So I think that's been a really interesting trend to observe.
So David, how does digitization and automation of asset management make a difference to that kind of experience? How do you get all those disparate systems that run asset management and customer experience work together to increase the NOI?
So there's a couple of things that works out. So at the top level, we've just talked about having to adjust and having to do more. And so we are trying to solve a problem of the teams that operate buildings being able to do more to increase satisfaction, not actually always telling them what that might be, but freeing up time for them to do that with less cost and less time. So the effort that you don't want your facility managers spending all their time in meetings trying to work out what's going wrong. You want them spending time with tenants saying, how can we improve? How are you going? Are you going to renew next year? There's a bit of more space that you could take. Those things get all compressed. And so you've got to use technology to free up time to allow that kind of activity to happen. The second is to provide the data that enables our partners to shape a new offering. So when it's, say, a tier 1 office space, now we're looking at tenants wanting neighbours 6, them wanting all sorts of things. They want it to stay there. They want it to be measured, and they will pay more for it. But they're doing that because they want people to come back to the office and they want to be able to feel good, not just on your skin, but in your soul when you're there, that you're in a place that you want to be and that you're doing the right thing. So then we've got to be able to provide the ability to get there, to maintain it. We spend a lot of our time trying to hold designs as much as advance them because they can drop over time. And the last piece is the bit that's much more direct. And these are things like, tenant comfort and airflow and all these things, and making it be the best possible thing. And we really do think about, it's got to be better than being at home. Yeah, you've got to feel like this is a great place to be.
Thanks for that. Just remind everyone in the audience, please keep sending it through your questions. I think probably at least half of what we've been talking about has come from you in our audience and hasn't been part of the scripted spontaneity that we prepared ahead of time. So please keep sending in those questions. It helps keep our panel members on their toes and they make for a really great conversation. So David, just turning our lens towards sustainability at the moment, how important are sustainability ratings to keeping tenants satisfied? Are you there, David? Hello.
Sorry, I've just come back. Apparently I've frozen for some reason.
Now you're back. There you go. I'll ask the question again. So the beauty of technology, I'm asking the technologist a question now. So how important are sustainability ratings to keeping tenants satisfied?
So a couple of things, some years ago, there was a movement towards environmental ratings, and a lot of them were mainly in the competitive part of the environment. So why is my property better than someone else's to use it and whatever else it is? And it was I won't say window dressing because of very serious activities by the clients in those areas, but it wasn't at the highest list so much in terms of what the tenants are starting to expect and other people are. That's evolved over time. And Australia is a really good example of this. The neighbours rating system, which is now being expanded to the UK, is a fairly basic system in terms of measuring things. It's not really, as Lisa said, it's not leading indicators, it's whatever else. But what it has done is it's shown that tenants will take those types of metrics into their leasing expectations and say, we want you to be at a certain level on ESG as well. They're now having to report that themselves on their own ESG accounts. So if they look at it and say, you're making it harder for me to get to net zero, that's going to be a problem because they all have the same requirements that are coming along. They're also, there is, and we touched this a little bit before, which is kind of an anti-technology question, but it's the feeling of being in a place as well that meets your values that is also starting to come across. And Chris mentioned people like Country Road and others, where it's much more than an efficiency thing. They're actually working very, very hard to create different experiences for their staff, for people who come in there and others. And that's part of what they consider to be the package. So the package of, which it never really was for a lot of our clients, but the notion that you're engaging just with a physical asset, we don't see as a technology company what that product is anymore. That product is responsiveness, pricing, physical experience, ESG. These are all the components that wrap around tenant expectations, and ESG is one of the fastest moving. I'd say flexibility and other things can also be up there as well, but one of the fastest moving changes. And certainly if you look at the market at the moment, the number of companies that are growing in just the ESG bit that we play into, but we're not just an ESG company, it shows the increasing demand. Every one of our clients and their tenants has got some significant ESG roadmap and project in place. So that's right up to the board level. They see it as important, right down to the individual level.
So, Chris, there are a lot of buildings that don't have that control capacity or flexibility to be efficient in the new ways, with the new way that we work and use our buildings and for our leisure. They need to have new load capabilities to enable smaller and less occupied spaces to be controlled individually. How do you design that at the concept stage? Are ops people in retail and offices being consulted early on in these discussions?
Look, I can talk to, look, it's evolution. So I think in that particular space, the development design brief is really the critical piece of work that needs to occur. Certainly now, when we're expanding or there's a number of developments going on around the portfolio at the moment, but there's, we work very closely with our development team and our consultant team to try and get that, get the synergy in the new build. Often, certainly in retail and shopping centres, you might have an asset or a building that's 30 years old, and we're tacking on some additional space, or we're building town centres. So you're trying to mesh this new versus old, and again trying to do it in a efficient and cost-effective manner, and that's always very challenging. We've been working hard. We've actually just renewed our sustainability design brief, and we've been working on that for the last 12 months to really try and get that to permeate through our development team and our consultant team and builders, and just bring everyone on the journey and ensure we're all heading in the right direction. but it's something that, and Lisa is nodding, it's something that's just an ongoing piece of work where you've got to keep the momentum and keep really your eye on the detail, because once it's costed and once it's starting to be built, it's too late often. Yeah.
We're seeing a real growth in demand for that, that whole sort of contribution of operational people into that process. And, the consultancy around design for maintenance and design for efficiency is something, I mean, we've added an offering into our business, AMS advisory offering with some technical people who've got really strong experience in that space and in asset planning space with a lot of retail focus there, just because there's a, increasing realization, I think, that we can't do things the way we've always done them before to achieve the outcomes that we're going to need around 2030 and around cost management in the environment we're in right now. And in our case,
I guess, sorry, the other key factor for QIC in particular is our clients. So our large investors have a real focus on this stuff, and that flows to the board, and then that flows down. So there is a real laser focus on ESG, and that's just not energy use, but that's obviously energy, water, community, slave labor, our contracts. It flows to that level, and it all molds where we're heading. Yeah. I mean,
the QIC, Chris, I was going to just ask you, Chris, you've got a number of initiatives around that very specifically, such as the installation of smart water meters. Can you just talk a little bit about what some of those measures are?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got our connected centers strategy. Again, that surrounds really the collection of data at each of the assets to really intensively manage them. So the smart water meters is just one example of that, and that's around, again, partly to improve our costs recovery and efficiency and return on investment, but also it drives down water usage. So again, it's if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And in shopping centres space, obviously the base build has a certain amount of water use, but you've got 500 tenants sitting in a shopping centre using water that we have little to no control over. We start metering those and billing individually. It soon becomes in their interest to reduce or change their habits. So that's one example. I think I mentioned before around our smart planning around our chiller and our large energy use equipment, where we're really managing those to the inch of their life. You've got other initiatives such as the solar. So our solar rollout is part of our net zero strategy, and will be helping us achieve that. And then you've a number of other activities around the portfolio, just from how we replace or what our capital planning, all the way down to our contracts and how our key partners are managing their ESG, certainly around cleaning and waste, and the list goes on. So there's a lot of activity and occurring not just in QIC but across the industry. I think, again, driven by the laser focus that the entire client base, your large superannuation funds, which are all our super, all our money in, and that's we're driving that. So it's that the circular piece that's coming around.
So, Lisa, I mean, obviously there's a need to balance sustainability with operational energy efficiencies and maintaining this great, tenant experience. What are some of the strategies that you've put in place, for example, to ensure that you've got optimal thermal comfort?
Look, necessarily see it as balancing. Actually, I do see these things as complementary. You know, yes, there's some of the ESG objectives involve, you know, substantial capex investment, but not all of them do. A lot of it is about optimization, and you know, optimization is where you get you know, operational excellence. It's just a hallmark of operational excellence, and that's what you need in order to have a comfortable environment and in order to have high tenant satisfaction. I think, you know, I think it was David who said earlier, as much of it is about communication and perception. You know, honestly, sometimes these things is perception is 9/10 of reality. If people are in a situation where there's good listening happening, you know, there's a fan that's rattling above their desk and it's really bothering them, that can absolutely poison the perception of that whole place. It might be it's probably a tenant piece of kit, right? But it takes to have a good facilities manager in the team who knows how to go and listen and acknowledge and say, yes, I can imagine that's a real problem for you. And let me do some investigation. Let me talk to the right people, see what can be done. That sort of stuff doesn't actually cost much money, but it can make all the difference in the world to you know, to comfort and to the stickiness of that tenant. So I think a lot of this stuff isn't actually expensive. In terms of, you know, and education is a big part of it. You know, I mean, some of these initiatives, I'm thinking, for example, neighbours waste. You know, one of the best ways to increase your diversion from landfill is to get rid of under-desk bins. Now, anyone who's ever gone through the journey of eliminating under-desk bins from their workplace knows it's traumatic. Like, people actually will come close to tears over not being able to throw their apple core, you know, under the desk. So those are situations where it's a real opportunity to take that trauma and turn it into really great conversations and engagement, where people suddenly realize what a huge difference they're making to the impact of their workplace on the environment. So it is all about good communication. In terms of maintaining optimal thermal comfort, I think, you know, there's kind of like the operational and then there's the strategic. I mean, for a group like ours, we've got a very diverse portfolio that we're managing. So there's, you know, it's not possible for us to have a homogenous approach. But, you know, I think the things that are consistent is that, you know, operationally, we lean very heavily on the system that we have, our FRC system, which allows us to track the number of tenant complaints by category. And if we see a real uptick in you know, complaints of a particular nature, such as too hot or too cold, that's a sign that something in the proactive maintenance hasn't been working and needs to be addressed really, really quickly. And then you've got your strategy, you know, that there's a variety of different strategies, and we often partner with SIM to have that, you know, benefit of that hardware and software and the engineering support as well, which is, you know, phenomenal when you can do that. And depending on the complexity of the building, we often have facilities managers who've got a really strong engineering background who can get in there as well and really fine tune. And some of those people are so passionate. They're just, you know, they're living and breathing what's happening on the screen with, you know, the timings of making sure things aren't operating when they earlier than they need to be or later than they need to be, or, you know, in areas where they don't need to be, all of that. So it's a huge discipline, and there's so much opportunity, and I think you're never done, no matter how new the building is, no matter how fancy the kit is, no matter how, you know, crack a team you've put together, no matter, you know, all of that, there's still always partnership and collaboration that's required to hold it from, you know, when it's performing really well, to hold it from dropping back over time, and just to continually be collaborating with your tenants and occupiers as well to make sure that their behaviours and use of the space is conducive.
Just one very quick thing that Lisa said in there, David, was that, you know, the importance of listening. You know, hearing that squeaky fan, or, you know, or seeing that flickering light, or whatever it is. But obviously, you know, you can't look or listen to every single thing that's going on. And I guess that's where the data and analytics bit comes in. How important is that is that now something you're seeing is becoming increasingly important, in terms of not just operational efficiencies, but also in driving tenant satisfaction?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are two main areas that kind of we focus on. One is removing the incident from occurring in the first place, and so the earlier that you know. So, there used to be measurement of tenant comfort across floors, for example, or even across entire buildings, and were they within a certain range of temperature and humidity. We all measure up to, I think, one building, 300 different independently measured zones. And we've all been in a building where it's cold here and hot there. And the systems at their aggregated level can say everything's going fine, but actually they're not for a large parts of it. So that kind of granular detail, which then can be sent to the FM and say, it's over here. Quite often that could be a tenant doing something, putting a light on something or having other things in there or whatever they might do. But unless you know where, you can't start the process of engaging quickly. We sort of look at issues fitting into kind of multiple buckets, but I'll give you three. So one bucket is equipment failures or things that happen over time or stuff like that. Another huge part is tenant caused issues. So, they're things that they've done. The other ones are just human interventions when there's been some mistake made or whatever else. The other one's actually in failures in design, that when the building was built, it works fantastic. When you put people in, it doesn't work anywhere near the way it is. And we deliver the same kind of data and value to brand new buildings as we do to older buildings. And it's a kind of common myth that they're perfect and whatever else. And as Lisa says, the maintenance of that is really important. So the data around trying to enable and empower people to remove a complaint before it ever happens. But if it happens, I'm proactive about it. I can go to them and say, we know there's a problem in this corner. We're already onto it. We're already dealing with it. Is way better than I've complained 6 times. I don't have an answer. Sometimes there may be a reason why you can't fix it. But if you're not communicating and you're not on top of things, the data's being used much more for that sort of empowerment of customer satisfaction than just fixing the kind of problems before they happen. So we're certainly seeing a big change in that kind of fine level that people are after.
Right. We're coming close to the end of our time, ladies and gentlemen. We've got about just a little bit under 10 minutes left, and we really want to just get through this last set of questions because I think they're super important. And they could almost be under the government's bumper sticker of "It's the economy." Everything's about the economy at the moment. Chris, there's a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty that's impacting every organisation, pretty much every person. I'm sure that every person on the panel and listening in today has borne the impact of some of what's going on in the macroeconomic environment. Chris, in retail, is there anything you can shift operationally to help respond to the cost of living spike?
Yes, is the answer. I think everyone in the industry, and in particular our QIC, we're focusing on that innovation and technology to manage or at least soften the inflationary pressures. As I mentioned before, certainly in shopping centres, where we're seeing outgoing increases of between 4 to 10% in some cases. Across, that historically a base of around 2% increase is roughly what we're used to. So, that's a huge change and something everyone's trying to manage as we speak right now, as we all prepare to get our budgets approved. So it is around that technology and innovation. So the issue shopping centres has, and no doubt commercial as well, is that it's the controllable costs, we call it. So your energy in particular, energy going up by sub 30% depending on how you're situated with your contracts, your gas going up 300% in Victoria, labour rates, minimum wage going up 5-6% year on year. So all that is really uncontrollable. What we can do is be more efficient in our use of those commodities, and that's where SIM come into it, and everything we've spoken about in the last hour. So those initiatives are strategic and they are longer term, but they're all starting to help the industry. The other key strategy around is your contract management, your partnerships across the industry. So with your key partners being, certainly in my space, being our HVAC and our labour providers and our vertical transport providers and our waste providers to really have a very, very close managed relationship with them. So, you know, everyone's working in the right direction and you're getting that efficiency.
So, David, how can property operators do more with less without compromising that tenant experience?
Well, certainly what we've seen is at the highest level, you know, the technologies that people like Sim have are fundamentally about less. So, you know, less expense on energy will save you money, even though the energy cost goes up. Less use of wage to solve problems means I'm insulated against somewhat increased wage costs. Better data enables you to put more pressure on vendors around how they need to step up to do things. Air conditioning, for example, is a great example of where the data is now available to really shine a light on performance improvements or non-improvements over time. So to drive those kind of longer term capacities. But that notion of taking as much as you possibly can out and you know, Chris talked about the efficiency, but if you tried to do that without a really smart system that enhance the tenant experience at the same time, you'd rob Peter to pay Paul. You'd save 10% over on cost, but you'd lose big tenants. And so you've got to be able to do both at the same time. So to us, that can happen in larger things that are happening. And Chris talked about some of those in solar and other things are really important, significant capital, but it can also happen in things that the customer doesn't even see. You know, just lots of things that happen all the time that make it better. But all that time is lowering the cost base of providing that service. So you can add more into that to try and insulate that. Then it gives people much more pricing pressure, both to increase charges, but also to drop if they think that they want to do that. It's a hard business. Most of our clients, they're not sitting on 60% margins where they can play around and things like this. These are tight businesses. And as Chris has said, a 2 or 3% higher increase is a really big deal across those organizations. But what we're saying is take the big chunks and take out of that cost. So in each of those ones you can do, and that requires working together.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, CIM's founder, Dave, who's not on the panel, not on today, has always said, and he said, I think for the 5 or so years that I've worked with him and known him, he said, the cheapest power you can get is the power you don't use. So if you can find ways to actually take the consumption out by being smart about what you're doing, that you can actually save significant amounts of money, even if the price is going up because you're just not using it. Lisa, last question for you. As tenants feel the pinch and look for cost-cutting measures during challenging times, how do you respond so that you do maintain tenant satisfaction and, importantly, also retention?
Well, I think, you know, I think there's always a focus on maintaining competitive outgoings budgets, and that rigor around those budgets is only going to increase and increase. You know, every line in the budgets are being interrogated at a really granular level. And I think there's a lot of innovation coming out of that, you know, because none of us want to tighten budgets and then reduce, you know, have the experience drop in the competitive environment that we're in. So we need to be replacing sort of raw expenditure with innovative solutions and efficient solutions. But I mean, some of this, you know, is up to the tenants. You know, it's within their tenancies. But I think really that the innovation around finding ways to link the customer experience and customer service piece with the data is really the key. You know, I think David's already mentioned those opportunities to have conversations with a client with a tenant where you say, there was an issue here and we identified it before you felt it and we've proactively rectified it. And now you are never going to feel that. That's a conversation that is, you know, doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it blows people away that someone has taken the time to have that communication. So that's the piece that we need to find ways to not, you know, labor is becoming one of the most expensive parts of this whole mix. The increases in, you know, labor costs at the moment are just They're really dramatic, but we still need to find ways to keep enough capacity within the teams that they can be having those proactive conversations about, I hear you, I observe what you're talking about, this is the plan. We can't fix it today, or maybe with the budget as it is, we may not be able to completely fix it, but this is what we are doing. And this is, we have heard you. Those conversations are so important in that environment.
Well, thanks to you, Lisa. Thanks for that answer. We are right at the end of our time. So I wanted to thank all three of our panelists, to Chris, to Lisa, and to David. I've certainly learned a lot. I've learned today being proactive is good, communicating is good, and don't steal the rubbish bins from under people's desks. Definitely been some big lessons for me to learn today. But I do want to thank everybody. Thank you for the questions that we did receive. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but for those that we didn't, we'll try to get back to you after the webinar at some point to respond to you. We look forward to seeing you all back again. We have another webinar in the coming up soon, so please keep an eye on CIM's LinkedIn page and in your email for when that next webinar comes up. But in the meantime, thank you to Chris, to Lisa, and to David, and thank you to everyone who's online today and has contributed to this webinar. Thanks very much.